The Shaping of Gondor, Part 4, The Line of Calmakiel, Chapter 2, Kin-Strife. Eldacar was now legally king, but it quickly became clear that his was not to be an uncontested reign. Almost from the moment of receiving word of Valakar's death in Ringare of 1432, the lords of the southern provinces of Harondor, Umbar, and Harad abjured all loyalty to Eldacar, and instead proclaimed Castamir of Pelargir as the rightful king of Gondor. This meant nothing, of course, unless the lords were prepared to support their claim by force, but that was precisely what they intended to do. They had waited and acquiesced to the commands of the untainted Romindakiel II and Valakar whilst they lived, but now, with those kings dead at last, they would wait and acquiesce no longer. As we have seen, there had already been scattered uprisings against King Valakar in the final years of his rule on account of the succession. Now these flared into outright rebellion, and ere 3 months had passed, all the Gondorian viceroys south of the Anduin had repudiated Eldacar in favor of Castamir. This marked the beginning of a 16-year civil war, which was to bring disaster to Gondor and her people on both sides of the contest. The Kin-Strife had begun. Eldacar was 177 years old at the time by the time that he reached the throne, hardly an untested youth. Although by now well into middle age, he had inherited all the lithe comeliness of his father, along with the red golden hair of his mother, Vidumavi, and so is often called Eldacar the Fair in the lore scrolls. He likewise shared the keen intelligence and devotion of his father and grandfather, whilst carrying the valor and hardiness of his northern kinsmen. These gifts would serve him well in the conflict that would unhappily loom over his reign. Like his father, Eldacar had travelled widely in the world, and he knew his realm and its people well. Following Valakar's recall to Gondor in 1260, he had grown up among the folk of the Seven Heartlands, whilst running many a royal errand among his future subjects. Castamir, 4 years younger than Eldacar, had also seen much, though in the seaward direction. As unprepossessing as Eldacar was fair, he was raven-haired, aquiline, and perpetually garbed in black. As a youth, he had ranged extensively throughout both the Bay of Belfalas and the Sea of Belagir in the service of Romindakiel II and of Valakar. Naturally, over the years he more than once crossed paths with his cousin Eldacar in the carrying out of his duties, and if any gracious words were ever exchanged between the two princes, the scrolls do not record them. There was little but bitterness between them from the beginning. As I recounted earlier, eventually Castamir succeeded his father Calamir's position of Master of Ships in Pelargir upon the latter's death in 1403. This in effect gave him charge of Gondor's navies, and it was whilst still holding this office that Valakar died, 29 years later. Almost immediately, the Pelargiri garrison declared him rightful king of Gondor, and was joined in swift succession by numerous other great southern cities of the realm. In a month's time, all of Lebanon had defected to him. By Nineveh of 1433, all of Harondor had joined his banner. By early Sulameh, Umbar and Harad had repudiated Eldacar, and Castamir had the whole of the empire south of the Anduin behind him. Some southern garrisons and principalities, feeling bound by honor and conscious of nothing else, remained loyal to the king, of course, but they were subsumed by the tide of rebellion and were quickly overpowered, killed, or forced to flee. In Karminilos, for instance, some 12,000 citizens picked up their belongings and trod north to South Ithilien in search of refuge from the rebel battalions. In the province of Belfalas, the small folk of the countryside were largely with Eldacar, whereas most of the citizens of the provincial chief city of Dol-Mirathas were in favor of Castamir. In Angard, the situation was reversed. The people of Tofalas overwhelmingly favored Castamir, whilst the Angarders themselves were heart and soul for Eldacar. The same was mirrored in a multitude of other cities, so that in all something like 250,000 common folk were displaced from their homes in the name of loyalty to one claimant or the other. Thus, by the spring of 1433, Eldacar was confronted by a dire situation indeed. With the provincial governments of all of Gondor south of the Anduin in rebellion, he had at a stroke lost over half of his manpower and tax revenue sources. In addition, although overborne by the surrounding populace, there were also many pockets of Castamir supporters even in the cities of the northern provinces, including Osgiliath. Informers, traitors, and spies slithered about on all sides. At first, Eldacar attempted a conciliatory path of action. In spite of their treasonous actions, he offered clemency to any and all of the lords who supported Castamir if they would only renounce the latter and return to the fold. There would be no executions, confiscations, or persecutions of any kind. Further, he promised to honor the great noble houses of Gondor, and to not infringe in any way on their sacred rights and prerogatives within the realm. In effect, he would concede to them whatever they wanted, provided that they merely acknowledged the legitimacy of his crown. This, however, was precisely what the southern lords were utterly opposed to doing. Their reply to the court in Osgiliath amounted to the blunt declaration that, as a consequence of his mixed blood, under the codes and traditions of the realm, Eldacar had no sacred or lawful right to sit upon the White Throne. They would bow to no king except Castamir of Pelargir, the rightful monarch by blood and divine ordinance. If, on the other hand, Eldacar presently conceded the throne to the latter, he and his family would be permitted to reside unmolested in Gondor, or to depart elsewhere if they wished. Eldacar, of course, rejected these terms out of hand. He would agree to whatever concessions the lords desired to soothe their pride, but he would under no circumstances abdicate the throne, which he regarded as his birthright. So, it was war despite everything. In the early months and years of the Kin-Strife, the outcome seemed to hang very much in the balance. Castamir swiftly took control of the imperial navy, nearly all of which deserted to his camp at the same time that the southern lords declared for him. In addition, he had the legions of Umbar and Harad at his command, thus giving himself the greater land force as well. Of what remained of the kingdom, Eldacar firmly retained the loyalty of the northernmost provinces of Calenarthon, Rovanien, and Dorwinion, together with the royal ward. The coastal regions were retained under the royal scepter as well, although only tenuously in the case of the highly traditional Lebanon and Amphalas and Belfalas. All the best mines, guild houses, and foundries remained under the authority of Osgiliath as well. Both contenders for the Gondorian throne had about equal material advantages then. Castamir struck first and hardest in the early seasons of the war. Supporters, either out of genuine zeal or self-interested desire for booty, flocked to join his banner from the southern environs, and his army in Pelargir swelled to enormous numbers as the months passed. Eldacar, to be sure, sent several battalions to confront the rebels, but lacking naval support, he could do little to harm Castamir's supporters, sheltered as they were behind the formidable walls of Pelargir. Furthermore, as observed before, since there was scattered favor for Castamir among the peoples of the royal ward, Eldacar was not entirely fulsome in his trust of his men and his captain's allegiance, and so preferred not to mass them in large numbers. The larger the host, the greater the potential loss to desertion, after all. This, unfortunately for Eldacar, proved to be a mistake. Had he marched south in the early months of the conflict and confronted Castamir when he had the chance, the war might just have been snuffed out quickly. He instead delayed, and in doing so gave his rival his great chance. In Sulamea of 1435, Castamir decided he possessed sufficient numbers to assail the capital, and marched northward. His forces numbered perhaps 20,000. The army had to live off the land, naturally, which called for the subjugation of the hinterland of Lebanon, and this slowed his progress somewhat. By Narquelier of 1436, this had been handily accomplished, and ere 3 months had passed, he stood before the walls of Osgiliath. Not since the long rebellion, in the time of Meneldil, 14 centuries earlier, had Osgiliath been faced with a besieging army. Much had changed in the intervening millennium and a half, however, and the capital found itself ill prepared for a beleaguering. The outer walls were by now crumbling, Fortifications were in a disgraceful state of decay, and the outlying districts had long ago spread beyond into the hinterlands of the royal ward, leaving them painfully vulnerable. A poor harvest season the previous autumn in the royal ward had likewise left the larders and granaries perilously low. To his credit, Eldacar had amassed what troops he could in the small time allowed him. However, it was far too short of what the situation called for, and he found himself outnumbered by nearly 4 to 1. There was no strong general for Eldacar to look to, as Meneldil had once looked to Tarkiel, so the king defended his city in person. But although the defenders resisted valorously for a month, it was hopeless. Acting on information provided by a traitor, Castamir's captains found an especially weak point in the ramparts and smashed through using catapults and battering rams. Sadly, Eldacar's eldest son and heir, Ornendil, was captured in the fray surrounding the breach. What followed was a fearsome sack, the likes of which had seldom been seen in Gondorian history. Castamir and his soldiers were bay folk, with no familiarity or love for the inland peoples of the realm, and nothing and no one were spared in their rampage. Hundreds of fine palaces and mansions were ransacked and put to the torch, including the Dome of the Stars, which was utterly destroyed. The great bridge of Atanatar Alcarine was broken. Something like 10,000 citizens were butchered, maimed, or ravaged in the carnage, whilst a goodly number managed to flee into the surrounding districts. These were pursued mercilessly, and a good part of the lands and estates of Ithilien and Anorion were devastated and burnt. Among the escapees was Eldacar, who, like Meneldil, elected uncertain flight over certain death. A devoted captain of the king named Arionel donned the royal helm and trappings, and drew off Castamir's pursuing forces, thus allowing the former to quietly slip out of the fallen city. For this deed, the name of Arionel eventually found its way onto the Pillar of Eternal Glory. With only his family and a small band of retainers, Eldacar swiftly made his way north in secret, and found refuge among his barbarian brethren in North Rovanion. Castamir was now effectively king of Gondor. Following the sack of Osgiliath, his first act was to promptly return to Pelargir and summon the Council of Gondor to confirm his kingship there. This they did, though many nobles of the northern provinces declined to attend under one pretext or another, or else out of defiance. And indeed, because he alone of Gondor's monarchs attained the throne through seizure rather than by inheritance, he is known in history as Castamir the Usurper. At first, for all its bloodshed and wanton destruction, Castamir's rule Castamir's rule was actually welcomed by many in the kingdom. The purity of the monarchy was restored, at least, and the traditionalist inhabitants of the realm rejoiced for that. In fact, he may have had the slim majority of the populace on his side in the early days of his reign. There remained, of course, plenty of rebellious sentiment in the northern and eastern regions of the realm, but bereft of leadership, it remained fairly harmless for the time being. This popularity did not last for long, however. Whatever his soldierly skills, Castamir was greedy, cruel, tyrannical, and made a poor king. Coastal provincial that he was, he all but abandoned Osgiliath in favor of Pelargir. He lavished gold upon the navy and upon those high nobles who supported him, and cared little for anything else. To support this patronage, taxes were doubled, then trebled. When those brave enough among the peoples of the Seven Heartlands protested these exactions, savage punishments were visited on them, in the form of imprisonment, slavery, or death. One particularly despicable demonstration of Castamir's ruthlessness came in 1445. In that year, the haven of Ethelond, which contained still a fair population of elven kind, refused to pay the taxes, on the ground that they owed allegiance only to the Lord of Linden. Castamir would have none of that, however, and callously ordered the ancient city put to the torch. Thousands died in this immolation of Ethelond, and poets and minstrels wrote many a song in verse lamenting the desecration of this once fair place. Then, in 1446, suspecting conspiracies all about him, Castamir had the imprisoned Prince Ornendil executed in order to staunch any lingering thoughts of rebellion on the part of his subjects, Naturally, of course, such an act of unchivalrous brutality was condemned throughout the land, and the common folk broiled with resentment towards their usurper king. But meanwhile, what of Eldacar? For 9 years he had been in exile in North Rhovanion, but he had been far from idle. With dauntless vigor he had gone about calling up aid among his northern kinsmen, and many among them had flocked to join the banner of this indefatigable man. The Northmanish king, Vadavidiu, a grandson of Vidugavia, likewise pledged his support to his cousin, and a large wildling army was gradually assembled. After receiving word of his son Ornindil's execution in the summer of 1447, he deemed the time right to strike south and confront Castamir. Into Rovanion he marched, at the head of an army of about 12,000 strong, and the peoples of the northern provinces welcomed him deliriously. Castamir and his rule had always been reviled there, and those of his magistrates who did not wisely join the malcontents quickly found themselves cut down. As they marched south, Eldacar's forces inexorably swelled in numbers, and by the time he reached the borders of the royal ward, he had something like 20,000 behind him. Osgiliath fell easily into his hands, as it had been long neglected by the sea-obsessed usurper, and was left almost unguarded. At almost the same time, the lords of Andrast, Anfalast, Lambton, and Belfalas, together with the northwestern provinces, abjured their allegiance to Castamir, having had quite enough of his ineptitude and viciousness. Only now, with disaster looming, did the latter bestir himself to launch a counterstroke, but this time it was Castamir's turn to be too late. Eldacar now had some 35,000 spears under his banner, whilst Castamir commanded perhaps 25,000 by comparison. Out of Pelargir these latter came marching belatedly, and the two forces encountered each other in Yavanye of 1447, near Erui Crossing, where a large ford in the river Erui was located. Although Eldacar challenged his rival to single combat on the field, Castamir cravenly declined, and thus battle was swiftly joined. It was a grueling and fierce contest, which raged for a full day and night, as brother fought and slew brother for the sake of royal loyalty. Though Eldacar had the advantage of numbers and cavalry, Castamir's warriors were no easy marks themselves, and their number were laced with Umbardrum and Haradrim archers and swordsmen, who were every bit as deadly as their Northmanish counterparts. Nevertheless, Eldacar's men fought with the knowledge of righteousness on their side, and the enemy was steadily worn down as the hours progressed. Then, as dawn broke over the hilltops, Eldacar's vanguard finally battered through Castamir's lines, and the two found themselves face to face at last. In the duel which followed, Eldacar struck and parried with all the agility of his Gondorian and Northmanish forebears, and though Castamir held his own well enough, it was Eldacar who landed the death blow with a well-aimed thrust through his enemy's abdomen. Castamir the usurper fell to the ground, dead. With their leader vanquished, the remainder of the usurper's forces were easily routed and sent fleeing back to Pelargir. The war was not ended just yet, however. Though Castamir himself might be dead, he left behind children, and still had many supporters in and around the city. The latter proceeded to shut themselves tight into the great port, and Eldacar was forced to place it under siege in an attempt to starve them out. Pelargir retained the use of its fleet, however, and this kept supplies coming in to the defenders, so there was little Eldacar could do at first. In the end, 6 months more went by before the besieging forces managed to disable enough of the ships by means of fireballs to overwhelm the defenses. Once again, though, the victory was bittersweet, for thousands of Pelargiri, including the family of Castamir, fled from the fallen haven to the south across the Harnen. Here they proved to be beyond Eldacar's reach, for with Castamir's death, both Umbar and Harad had renounced all allegiance to the White Throne, and the latter lacked the strength in numbers and weapons to bring them to heel. Nevertheless, Eldacar's troops marched triumphantly through Harondor, reducing everything in their path. Yarminilos was taken, and ere Hisamay of 1448 was over, Eldacar was in firm control of all the lands north of the Harnen. There was no further resistance to his banner following this, and after securing the northern river bank, Eldacar pronounced the enemy defeated, and the war at an end. After 16 bloody years, the Kin-Strife was over.